You're old and senile. You're nothing but a problem for this house." Those bitter words from Ryan, the man I once treated as my own son, hit me as I stood hidden behind the kitchen doorway. For 14 years, I used these carpenters' hands to build a life for them, only to find that in their eyes, I was just an asset waiting to be liquidated. They think I'm confused, that it's time to cast me out of my own life to make room for their financial schemes. But they are mistaken. This old carpenter knows how to build everything from scratch, and he certainly knows how to dismantle every filthy plan when the final line is crossed. Before I flip the script, I want to ask you, what would you do if you realized the people you loved most saw you as nothing more than a number on a balance sheet? If you've ever felt like you were becoming excess in your own family, hit like and subscribe now, because tonight, the verdict I deliver will begin with the very signatures they've been waiting for. That day was a gray afternoon, the kind of weather typical of the coastal town where I had lived for nearly 30 years. The wind carried the smell of salt from the harbor inland, strong enough to make the back door of Ryan's house creak softly when I pushed it open. I wasn't there for anything serious, just an old insurance file the company had mistakenly sent to my house related to a pickup truck Ryan had once had under his name a few years earlier. I had called Linda around noon. She said she was visiting an old friend on the north side of town and might be home late. Her voice sounded normal, even a little rushed. Ryan's car was parked in the driveway. Nothing unusual, but Linda's dark blue sedan was there too, under the old maple tree in front of the house. I stood still for a few seconds, my hand resting on the pocket of my jacket where the pocket watch sat neatly. I wasn't in the habit of doubting people in my own home. At least, not until that moment. I didn't ring the bell. The back door was usually unlocked when Ryan was home. I stepped inside and called their names out of habit, but my voice came out quieter than usual. Voices drifted in from the kitchen, not loud but clear enough. Linda's voice, steady and low. Ryan's voice, dry and quick, the kind of voice used to talking about paperwork. I stopped at the threshold, where the kitchen light spilled onto the tile floor. They didn't know I was there, and I heard everything. They talked about separating assets, the way people talk about a procedure that needs to be completed before the end of the year. Ryan used smooth words, the kind legal consultants use when they want everything to sound harmless. Linda asked a few follow-up questions, not to object, but to be sure. "If he signs while he's still of sound mind, no one can argue it, right?" she asked. Ryan answered immediately, without hesitation. Then came that sentence, the one I mentioned at the beginning of this story. Ryan said it without raising his voice, without anger, almost casually, as if I weren't a living, breathing person, but a line item on a balance sheet, a temporary holder, someone holding things for now. I didn't take another step, not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because my body simply didn't want to move forward. There are moments when, if you move, everything collapses in a way you can't undo. I stood there, leaning lightly against the wall, listening as they went on, talking about timelines, about how I shouldn't be stressed, about how to make everything look like a reasonable decision for old age. I left before they finished. I didn't slam the door. I didn't leave any sign. Outside, the wind had picked up. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove off like I always did. It wasn't until I turned out of that street that I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The road home runs along the harbor. I had driven that road thousands of times, early mornings when the water was still flat, or late nights after finishing dock repair work. That day, I had to slow down because my hands were shaking. I pulled out my pocket watch and wound it out of habit. The ticking sounded the same as always, but the feeling wasn't. I thought about the early years when Linda moved in with me. She brought Ryan with her. Back then, he was a skinny, quiet young man who always lowered his head when greeting me. I remembered the first time I took Ryan down to the harbor, showed him how to read the tide, how to tell the sound of wood when it's damp. He called me Sir for months before switching to James and eventually to Dad. I believed in that. I believed that in my 40s, I could still build a family in a different way, slower, but more solid. The years that followed weren't loud. I worked. Linda took care of the house. Ryan studied, then drifted between unstable jobs. I didn't push him. I thought everyone has their own pace. I signed papers when they asked. I let Ryan keep some files because he was better with legal stuff. I didn't count how many times I signed. I only knew that I trusted them. By the time I turned into my driveway, the sky had darkened. The wooden house stood still, the porch light still off. I sat in the car for a while, listening to the distant waves. The unease was no longer a vague thought. It had shape. It had a voice. It had a plan. I wasn't angry right away. I didn't hurt in a loud way either. What I felt was like standing on an old bridge and suddenly hearing a faint crack beneath your feet. No one else hears it, but you know that from that moment on, you can't walk the same way anymore. That night, I placed the pocket watch on the bedside table and didn't wind it again. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, not to find answers, but to listen for what was still left in my head that hadn't been pushed aside. There were signs I had ignored, questions I hadn't asked, and one thing stood out clearly, even though I didn't want to admit it. What I heard in that kitchen wasn't a sudden idea. It had the shape of something prepared, arranged, rehearsed in someone else's mind for a long time. And somehow I had been living inside that plan without ever knowing it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. It was still dark, and the sound of the distant waves was like a heavy, steady breath, indifferent to whatever had just happened in my house. I went down to the kitchen, turned on the yellow light over the counter, and brewed a strong pot of coffee the way I'd been drinking it since my days as a helper on construction sites. The smell spread, covering the old wood scent of the house. I opened the drawer to find a dish towel, and my hand touched the pocket watch I had placed there the night before. I wound it, listened to the ticking, then slipped it back into my jacket pocket out of reflex. Linda came home late last night. I didn't ask. She walked into the bedroom quietly, took off her shoes, said, "I'm exhausted," and turned away. Everything looked like a normal night, except I heard the sound of fabric brushing together more clearly, the drawer closing, and the silence between us felt longer. I lay still, eyes open, not to watch, but because I couldn't sleep. She came down to the kitchen once it was brighter outside, hair neatly tied up, beige sweater, phone in hand. She glanced at the coffee pot, looked at me for a second, then smiled out of habit. "You're up early." Her voice was light, no sign of trouble. I nodded and slid a mug toward her. She sat down, opened her phone, scrolled through the news as if yesterday hadn't happened. I watched her fingers on the screen, her carefully done nails, and remembered her voice through the kitchen doorway, asking Ryan if no one could argue as long as I signed while I was of sound mind. I stood up, pretended to look for something in the cabinet. "Who did you visit yesterday?" I asked, as casually as asking about the weather. Linda didn't look up. "Martha. She's moving. Everything's a mess." She answered smoothly without pause. I nodded slightly and poured more coffee. "In this town, everyone knows Martha. She lives on the north side, just like Linda said. A name reasonable enough to cover everything." I didn't ask more. I was afraid my voice would change if I did. Around 9 a.m., I drove to the company. My small office sits near the road leading out to the harbor. The wooden sign out front was faded, some letters peeling. I'd thought about replacing it, but kept putting it off. I walked in, greeted the workers having coffee outside. They nodded and called, "Morning, boss," like always. I answered, keeping my tone normal. In my office, I opened the filing cabinet where I kept old contracts and dockside land deeds. I didn't tear everything apart. I looked for one very specific thing, the original contract for the small plot of land next to the pier, which I had bought 12 years earlier as a backup for expanding the business. I remembered the dark blue folder clearly, the handwritten label "Dock Lot" in the corner. I pulled drawer after drawer. It wasn't there. I stood still for a moment, then looked around the room as if someone had just walked out. No one. The door was locked. The windows were closed. I pulled out my phone to call Ryan, but my finger stopped before pressing the screen. I didn't want to hear his voice right then. I opened my contacts and called Clara instead, my former accountant who had retired years ago and later became an attorney. She still came by occasionally to help me check the books and keep my paperwork clean. Clara picked up after 2 rings. "James, what's going on?" Her voice was sharp, the voice of someone who had spent her life with numbers. I told her I was looking for a file and asked if she remembered me giving it to anyone recently. Clara paused for a beat. "Did you give Ryan a stack of documents back in October? I remember him stopping by, saying he was helping you organize some things." I swallowed. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. Clara exhaled lightly. "Do you want me to come by the office?" she asked. I looked at the clock on the wall. "Not yet. I just wanted to be sure." I set the phone down and opened my desk drawer. Inside were other files, papers I kept separate because I trusted no one but myself with them. I flipped through the list. Some accounts receivable, a few dock repair contracts in progress, and the company's bank account information. Everything looked fine. But the feeling that someone had touched my life without my knowing clung to the back of my neck like cold air. Around noon, Linda texted asking if I was coming home for lunch. I replied, "Busy." Her message popped up. "Okay, don't forget Ryan's coming over for dinner tonight." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Ryan coming over for dinner. Not asking if I was free. Just informing me. It reminded me of how, in recent months, Ryan's stopping by had become more frequent. Sometimes with a bottle of wine, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes just talking about how older people need to prepare early. I had listened, nodded, smiled it off because I thought it was concern. That afternoon, as I drove home, a light rain started falling. Rain in Oregon never pours. It drizzles, clinging to the windshield in a hazy film. I turned on the wipers, watched the road, tried not to think, but memories seeped in like water through cracks. I remembered a winter 14 years ago when Ryan had just moved in with us. That night, strong winds tore part of the back awning loose. I put on a knit hat, grabbed a flashlight, climbed the ladder. Ryan stood below, holding it steady, face tense. "Dad, let me come up with you," he said. I let him climb up and showed him how to place the boards, how to hammer nails so the wind wouldn't rip them out. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from fear of doing it wrong. I said one simple thing. "Just take it slow. Don't rush." He nodded and worked carefully. When we finished, we sat under the awning drinking hot cocoa Linda had made. Ryan looked at me, eyes red from the wind, and said clearly, "I don't need an inheritance. I just need you to trust me." That sentence had warmed my chest back then. It sounded like someone wanting to be seen, wanting a place, and I trusted him enough to give him the filing cabinet key, enough not to count how many times he took papers home to organize. Trusted him enough to forget that trust, placed in the wrong hands, can turn into a quiet vice, tightening slowly, barely noticeable at first, but crushing once you finally realize what's happening. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. I didn't tell Linda. I wanted to see things as they were before Ryan walked in with his smiles and questions about paperwork. The house was lit, the smell of grilled meat coming from the kitchen. Linda was chopping salad, soft music playing on the old radio. She turned and smiled. "You're home." Anyone watching from outside would think I was living in a stable family. Ryan arrived at 6:30 p.m. He wore a dark jacket, hair neatly combed, carrying a paper bag from the bakery. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone as familiar as always. I shook his hand. His skin felt cool and firm. He glanced around the house, his eyes sweeping the living room, then pausing briefly at the hallway leading to my office. Just briefly, but enough. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He asked about the weather at the harbor, about whether work was going smoothly this week, questions that sounded like concern. At dinner, Linda told the story about Martha moving, just as she had that morning. Ryan nodded along, added a few details, as if he knew it well. I chewed slowly, listening to the clink of cutlery, to Ryan's laughter at the right moments. I looked at Linda's hands on the table, her wedding ring shining under the light. I looked at Ryan, who had called me Dad for 14 years. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a strange harmony between the two of them, like they were walking the same road I hadn't been invited onto. After dinner, Ryan stood up to help Linda clean, then turned to me. "Dad, about those papers we talked about before," he said casually. "Do you remember the dockside land file?" My heart skipped. I set my glass down, hearing the ice tap against it. "Yeah, why?" I asked. Ryan smiled and held out his hand, like asking for something ordinary. "Can you give me the original? I want to make copies, just in case. Makes things easier later." Linda stood by the sink, not looking at me, but her hands paused on the plate, waiting for my answer. I didn't answer right away. I felt the pocket watch in my jacket, as if it could tell me when to speak, when to stay quiet. Then I stood up and walked toward the hallway, aware of a gaze pressing into my back. I opened the office door. The room was dark, smelling of old paper and pine. I turned on the light. The filing cabinet stood there, still locked. I pulled open the drawer where that contract should have been. Empty. No blue folder, no dock lot. I stood there for a second, then heard footsteps behind me. Ryan was standing in the doorway. He didn't step inside, but his eyes went straight to the cabinet, like someone who knew exactly what he was waiting for. "Can't find it?" he asked, his voice still light. I turned to look at him. The overhead light lit his face clearly, calm to the point of discomfort. I didn't answer immediately. I opened another drawer, flipped through unrelated papers as if I had simply mistaken the place. Ryan stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, waiting. Linda was out in the hallway. The sound of running water at the sink had stopped at some point. "I'll look again later," I said, closing the drawer and locking it carefully. "The original is still in the house." Ryan nodded, didn't ask anything else. He just said one small sentence, almost offhand. "You've been forgetting things lately. I worry." I stepped out of the room and closed the door. Linda stood in the kitchen, drying a plate that was already clean. She looked at me, as if quickly checking whether I was about to lose my temper. I pulled out a chair and sat down. "I'll check at the office tomorrow," I said evenly. "Probably put it somewhere else." Linda smiled, a thin smile. "Yeah, better be careful. At our age, paperwork gets misplaced easily." The words "at our age" dropped onto the table like a cold coin. Ryan went back to the living room and turned on the television, pretending to watch the news. I stayed in the kitchen a few more minutes, finished my water, then went upstairs. I didn't want to look at them anymore. Not because I was afraid, but because if I looked too long, something would show on my face. That night, I didn't touch the pocket watch. I left it on the bedside table, right where I usually put my reading glasses. I lay on my side, listening to Linda's steady breathing. In the dark, small details I had once overlooked became painfully clear, like a room suddenly flooded with light. The questions about property documents. The times Linda suggested letting Ryan keep things organized. The moments she asked me to sign papers that were just address confirmations. I had signed because I trusted. An older man often doesn't want to turn his own home into a battlefield by doubting his wife and child. The next morning, Linda got up early, put on her jacket, and said she was going to the grocery store. I nodded. She stepped out the door, then stopped and came back in. "Remember, the bank is calling today to reconfirm some things with our joint accounts. Make sure you answer. I asked them to issue a secondary card for Ryan again, so it's convenient if needed." "Which joint account?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. Linda frowned, as if I'd just asked something strange. "The family account, the one you said we should open to manage expenses." I don't remember ever saying that, but I didn't argue. I just gave a small nod and let her leave. When the door closed, I stood still in the living room for a moment. Then I went straight into my office, opened the desk drawer, and took out the old notebook I used to track construction materials. I didn't write anything right away. I just opened to a blank page, set the pen down, then lifted it again. It had been a long time since I'd done this kind of note-taking for anything related to family. That was something I reserved for contracts, figures, schedules, but the feeling in my chest at that moment didn't allow me to keep living on vague trust. Around 11 a.m., the landline rang. The caller ID showed my local bank branch, the one I'd been working with since I first opened the company. A polite female voice greeted me, confirmed my identity, then spoke about updating access permissions. She read out an account name along with the last 4 digits. I didn't recognize it. "Sorry," I said, "I'm not familiar with that account." There was a brief pause. "Sir, this is a secondary account linked to the main family account. The joint holders are Mrs. Linda and Mr. James." I leaned back in my chair. "What is the secondary account used for?" "For easier allocation of expenses. Our system shows that you authorized its setup and approved automatic transfers within a set limit." I tightened my grip on the receiver. "What limit?" She read out a number clearly enough for me to hear, without changing her tone. Each transfer wasn't large, just a few hundred, sometimes 1,000, but the frequency was steady. She continued reading as if she were reciting the weather. I looked out the window and saw mist clinging to the glass. "Who is the recipient?" She hesitated. "The receiving account is under the name Ryan Miller." I set the receiver down gently, so softly it didn't make a sound. In my mind, I saw Ryan standing in my office doorway the night before, calmly waiting. He wasn't surprised because he knew where the file was, knew where the money was going, knew even the things I didn't know. I picked the phone up again. "Please check when these transfers started." I heard her clicking through records. "Since February of the year before last, sir." A year and a half. Money dripping away. Not a single sharp pull that would make me notice immediately, but a slow leak, slow enough for me to keep believing my home was peaceful. "And who set up the automatic transfers?" I asked. Her voice stayed polite, but one sentence made my spine go cold. "The system shows that you already authorized it." I stayed silent. I knew I couldn't yell at a bank clerk. I also knew that if I said, "I didn't," it would make me sound like an old man denying the obvious. I took a breath and asked another question, more carefully. "Is there a physical authorization form?" "Yes, sir. The documents are on file at the branch. There's also a scanned copy attached." "I'll come by." I hung up. The house was still quiet. The wall clock kept ticking. But everything felt different, as if someone had just pulled out a critical nail from the floor beneath my feet. I went to the garage and grabbed my car keys. Before leaving, I walked over to the small table by the door where Linda usually left the mail. There were a few bank envelopes, some utility bills. I didn't open her mail. I only looked at the sender names. One thick envelope, its corner slightly bent, read Asset Services. I put it back exactly where it had been. On the way to the bank, I took the long route past the harbor. Old habit. That road calmed me because it was tied to something I'd built with my own hands. I drove slowly, looking at the fishing boats sitting still, the rain-soaked dock planks. This work had taught me discipline. It hadn't taught me how to deal with family using that discipline to bind me instead. The bank wasn't crowded. I walked in and greeted Tom at the front desk. Tom wasn't young anymore. Gray hair, thin-framed glasses. He looked up and smiled in recognition. "James, haven't seen you in a while." "I need to review the account authorization documents," I said. Tom led me into a small room in the back where long-term clients usually signed paperwork. He brought out a stack of documents, placed them in front of me, and turned them the right way. I looked at the signature. It looked like mine, slanted with a habit of stretching out the J. But something was off. The pressure was different. The spots where I usually pause to adjust my grip were too smooth here. "Who submitted this?" I asked. Tom checked his screen, answering more slowly. "Mrs. Linda came in. She had your identification and said you were busy, so she handled it for you." "Did you call me to confirm?" I asked. Tom hesitated. "The system shows a call was made to the home number, and confirmation was completed using the security questions." At that point, I knew I couldn't dig deeper there. Not because I was afraid, but because every word I said would turn into a record. I folded the papers and slid them gently back toward Tom. "I want to temporarily freeze all automatic transfers from the family account until everything is verified in person." Tom looked at me longer than usual. "That will cause inconvenience." "I need inconvenience," I said. Short. Enough. Tom nodded and didn't ask anything else. He handed me a confirmation form and asked for my signature on the spot. I signed slowly, carefully, like driving a new nail into a wooden floor that had just lost one. When I walked out of the bank, it was still raining. I got into my car but didn't start it right away. I opened my notebook and wrote a few lines: date and time, account numbers, when the transfers began, the recipient's name. I wasn't writing for revenge. I was writing because I needed to know where I was standing in a story someone else had already written for me. And if they wanted to turn me into just a name on paper, I would start by holding on to the truth, line by line. I got home as the sky began to lighten. The rain had eased, but the road was still streaked with water. I parked in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat for a few seconds, letting my heartbeat return to normal. The notebook felt bulky in my jacket pocket, like a foreign object. I walked inside, hung up my coat, washed my hands longer than necessary, as if I could wash away the feeling of having signed something irreversible. Linda was in the kitchen, her back to me. She set a bag of vegetables on the counter and began putting things away. "Where did you go?" she asked casually without turning around. "The bank," I said. There was a very brief pause. Linda kept arranging the groceries, but her movements slowed. "Is something wrong?" "I froze the automatic transfers," I said, like reporting a plumbing fix. "I want to verify everything directly." Linda turned around then. The smile on her face didn't disappear, but it came a beat too late. "Why would you do that on your own? I'm using that account for expenses." "I'm using it too," I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her, long enough. Linda put her hands on the counter and exhaled. "You've been too tense lately. I told you, you should cut back on work. At this age, why are you still trying to hold everything yourself?" It sounded like advice, but there was a blade inside it. I didn't argue. I walked past her into my office and locked the bank confirmation form in the drawer. I heard Linda making a call in the kitchen, her voice low and quick. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the urgency in the tone. That afternoon, just as I expected, Ryan showed up without warning. His car screeched to a stop in the driveway, tires splashing water onto the steps. I was standing on the porch, checking some damp boards. Ryan got out and slammed the door harder than usual. "Dad," he called, but the words sounded procedural. Linda stepped out behind me, drying her hands on her apron. She looked at Ryan like he'd come to handle something, and I stood between them, like a chair being pulled out of place. Ryan walked straight into the house without asking. "What's going on with the bank?" he said as he entered the living room, as if he had the right to interrogate me there. "My card just got declined." "That's my account," I said, still calm. "I just want to verify things." Ryan let out a short, dry laugh. "Verify what? You think someone's stealing from you?" Linda stood by the kitchen doorway, silent. Her silence meant this was no longer just between Ryan and me. It was a stage, and she had chosen to sit with the audience. "I didn't say anyone was stealing," I said. "I just want clarity." Ryan stepped closer, close enough for me to smell his cologne mixed with rain. "Clarity? The clarity is you're old and forgetful. You cause trouble, then make everyone clean it up." His words stiffened my neck for a second, but I didn't react. I looked at Linda, waiting for a sign, "That's enough," or "Don't talk like that." She only looked down at her hands. Ryan continued as if given permission. "Do you know what the neighbors think? This morning you go to the bank, this afternoon you freeze accounts, tomorrow you'll be calling the police saying paperwork's missing. Who takes the blame?" I heard the front door open. Our neighbor, Frank, stepped onto the porch holding a misdelivered package. He stopped when he saw Ryan standing in the living room, his voice raised. Frank looked at me, then at Ryan, uncertain. Ryan spun toward the door, as if Frank's presence were an opportunity. "Frank," he said loudly, "do you see this? James has been acting up lately. We just want him to rest." I looked at Frank. He stood there, blinking, not knowing whether to step in or back away. I could see the discomfort of a middle-aged neighbor who didn't want to get pulled into family matters. But Ryan's words had dragged me into the open, in front of a witness. "Ryan," I said, my voice still low but sharper, "don't involve other people." Ryan shrugged. "Other people? You're turning the whole neighborhood into other people. You act like everything is still yours, but the truth is, you're just a name on paper." That sentence again. Not through a doorway, but right in front of me, in front of Linda, in front of the neighbor. I saw Frank swallow, set the package down on the porch chair, take a step back and stammer, I'll just leave this here. You talk." Then he turned and left quickly. The door closed. The space inside the house felt suddenly smaller. Ryan watched Frank go, then turned back to me, his eyes challenging. "See? Everyone thinks you should step aside." "I'm not arguing here," I said and walked toward my office. Ryan moved faster and blocked the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. "You're not going in there anymore," he said. I stopped. "That's my room." Ryan smirked. "It was your room. Now you just make things worse. Let me handle it." "Handle what?" I asked, meeting his eyes. "The paperwork, the accounts, the things you can't keep up with anymore," Ryan said, his voice rising as if speaking for the whole world. "You think you're still in control, but the reality is, you're a problem." The word problem dropped like a blade cutting a rope. I felt Linda step closer behind me, her breath near my neck. I waited for her to say something. She didn't. Her silence was no longer neutral. It was confirmation. I reached into my jacket out of habit, touching the pocket watch. The cold metal met my fingers, and heat rose in my throat. I tried to step past Ryan, not pushing, just turning the way a homeowner would. Ryan reached out, placed his hand on my chest, and shoved lightly but firmly. Not enough to knock me down, but enough to make me step back. That touch, the way he claimed the right to block me in my own house, tightened something inside me. The pocket watch slipped from my pocket. A sharp metallic clink as it hit the wooden floor, then rolled slightly under the light. The whole house seemed to hold its breath. I bent down to pick it up. My back curved a little more than usual. Not from pain, but because something inside me had just been bent out of shape. I held the watch in my palm, saw the light scratch on the glass, watched the hands still moving. They moved steadily, calmly, as if time didn't care who was standing where. Ryan watched me crouch, and I saw no remorse in his eyes. Only impatience, like someone eager to finish an unpleasant task. I straightened up. I didn't shout. I didn't raise a hand. I said just one word, short enough not to shake. Okay. Ryan frowned, dissatisfied that I hadn't reacted the way he wanted. Linda stayed silent. She glanced at the watch in my hand, then turned her face away. I walked down the hall into the living room and grabbed my jacket. Ryan called after me. "Where are you going? Don't do anything stupid. Don't call anyone. Don't make a scene." I stopped at the door and turned back. I wanted to say many things, but if I spoke, I'd speak in anger, and I didn't want to give them that. I looked at Linda one last time. She didn't look back. I stepped outside. The rain was falling again. I got into my car, closed the door, and only then did I let out a breath. I didn't drive right away. I opened the pocket watch and looked at the inside, where my father had engraved a small line. I didn't read it aloud. I just touched it with my finger, like touching a reminder. My endurance had reached a point where I could no longer lie to myself. But I also knew that if I made one wrong move, they would use it to turn me into the out-of-control old man they wanted me to be. I took out my phone and looked at my contacts. There were many numbers, business partners, acquaintances, workers, but there was only one person I knew wouldn't tell me to calm down, wouldn't say, "Think of the family," and wouldn't see me as a problem to be managed. I pressed call. As the line rang, I tightened my grip on the pocket watch in my palm, as if holding on to the last thing that was truly mine. The call was answered after 2 rings. "This is Clara." I didn't bother with small talk. "I need to see you, today." Clara didn't ask why. She only asked where I was and told me to drive straight to her old office on the south side of town, near the road leading to the harbor. "I still have the keys. I'll open up. Don't let anyone follow you," she said. Her voice was the same as it had always been, clean, solid, not a word wasted. I drove out of the neighborhood, past 2 familiar intersections, past the bakery Linda used to stop at, past the church parking lot where I'd once fixed the roof for free after a storm. This small town has roads that make you think nothing ever changes. But in that moment, I felt like I was driving on a thin wire, with a drop beneath me I had never looked down at before. Clara's office was on the 2nd floor of a low building, the sign long since removed. I knocked in the pattern of 2 knocks, a pause, then 1. Clara opened the door, pulled me inside immediately, and locked it again, like sealing a lid. Inside, it still smelled of old paper and printer ink, the scent familiar to people who have spent their lives with ledgers. Clara looked me over from head to toe. "Are you okay?" "I'm still standing," I said, "but they've started treating me like something that needs managing." Clara nodded, not surprised. She pulled out a chair for me, switched on the desk lamp, and set a bottle of water in front of me. "Start from the beginning," she said. I told it quickly, without embellishment, the secondary account, the signature that didn't quite look like mine. Ryan blocking the office door, the pocket watch hitting the floor. I stuck to the facts. But when I reached the part where Ryan said, "You're just a name on paper," my voice stalled for a beat. Not because it hurt, but because that sentence smelled like planning. Clara listened, then looked straight at me. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I placed my notebook on the desk and opened to the page I'd written. "I want to know what I still control, and what they're actually going after." Clara pulled the notebook closer, scanned the numbers and dates, then reached into a drawer and took out a thin folder. "Do you remember 3 years ago when you asked me to help you restructure your assets for tax purposes and to protect the business?" she asked. I nodded. Back then, I thought it was just routine work for someone in business. I wanted things clean and clear, no mixing between company and family. Clara opened the folder and pointed to a few pages. "Some assets are in your personal name, yes. This house, a few investments, some joint accounts, but the backbone of what you own is somewhere else." She tapped her pen on a bold line of text. "Cole Harbor Works, LLC. I looked at the company name, the word harbor anchoring it. "What are you saying?" Clara looked at me and spoke slowly, like stamping a fact into place. "Most of your real assets sit under the company. Equipment, contracts, reserve funds, and the dockside lot you've been looking for the original deed to. It hasn't been in your personal name for 3 years. It was transferred into the company properly." I straightened. "Ryan doesn't know?" Clara curved her mouth, half smile, half not. "If he did, he wouldn't be circling around trying to grab an old contract. He's working from an outdated map." I stayed quiet for a moment, listening to the rain tap the window. Part of me wanted to exhale in relief, like finding a solid plank in a floor that had been shaking. But another part of me went cold. If Ryan and Linda had been moving step by step without knowing this, it meant they were acting based on what they thought I owned, not what I actually controlled. And that made them more dangerous, because when people realize they're wrong, they tend to take risks. Clara slid out another sheet. "But you need to understand this. The way they set up the secondary account, drip-fed the transfers, used access permissions, this isn't just greed, it's a habit of control. And that habit won't stop just because you froze one account." I looked at the rows of numbers. Each transfer was only a few hundred, sometimes 1,000. Small enough to ignore, but added up, it told a story. Clara scribbled a few quick calculations on scrap paper and pushed it toward me. "See? A year and a half, and it's already over $40,000. Not an amount that bankrupts you. It's a footprint." I nodded. "I want to know what else they've signed." Clara opened her old laptop, powered it on, and typed into a file she still kept. "I'm not officially working anymore, but I kept copies of the old structure, transfer dates, company paperwork, account lists. If you want to check, you have to go step by step, no rushing. Because right now, you're in the position where they want you to react like an out-of-control old man." I gave a dry smile. "They said exactly that." Clara looked at me, her voice dropping. "James, listen to me. You were never stupid. You were just decent. And decent people often get pushed into having to prove they're not crazy." That hit me harder than I expected. I looked at my hands on the desk, the old calluses still there even though I don't do heavy work like I used to. I built this harbor with discipline and trust. I once saved a stalled project after a storm, kept dozens of families paid through the winter. People called me when they needed problems solved. But in my own house, I'd been turned into the problem. Clara slid a list toward me. "These are the things they can easily see. Joint accounts, secondary credit cards, personal savings, house paperwork. And this," she tapped the company section, "is what they can't touch if you keep a proper boundary between business and personal life." I looked at her. "I don't want to burn my house down." "Setting boundaries isn't burning the house down," Clara said. "Setting boundaries is locking the right doors." I let out a long breath. In my mind, I saw Linda standing still while Ryan shoved me back. That image cut deeper than Ryan's words. I didn't want to turn this into a war, but I couldn't keep living like a guest in my own place. "What should I do next?" I asked. Clara didn't answer with vague advice. She started listing actions like an accountant laying out a quarterly plan. First, you separate all personal banking access and require in-person verification. Second, you request full statements, print them, and store them somewhere they can't reach. Third, you review any authorization documents, medical, financial, power of attorney. Anything you didn't sign or signed while being steered, you need to know about. I nodded at each point. Clara paused, then continued, her voice lower. Fourth, you look at the legal issue around the use of your signature. If that signature was forged or security questions were misused, they've crossed a very dangerous line. I looked straight at her. Do you think they forged it? Clara didn't answer immediately. I don't have enough data yet, but I see something. She pulled out her phone and opened a photo of a document she'd saved. This is your signature on the asset transfer into the company 3 years ago. This is the signature on the secondary account authorization Tom showed you. She held the two images side by side. I studied them. The slant was similar, but the pressure was different. The tail of the J on the other document was longer, smoother, practiced. I'm not an expert, but I know my own hand. I know how I tend to pause for a split second, a habit from years of carpentry, always checking before driving a nail. Clara turned off the screen and looked at me. Ryan is the one who helps you with paperwork. He's had plenty of chances to see your signature, and he's doing this with the confidence of someone who thinks you won't react in time. Something warmed in my chest, but I kept it contained. I didn't want heat. I wanted clarity. You still have one advantage, Clara said. You have a clean history, you have credibility, and you have time if you use it right. They don't. They're in a hurry. I touched the pocket watch in my jacket without opening it. In a hurry for what? Clara looked at me, then pointed to a line in the file. Because you're getting close to the age people like to use as an excuse. They'll say you're confused. They'll say you need rest. They'll say they're protecting you. And if they get a comprehensive power of attorney, they can legally lock you out of your own life. I sat still. That was the part that chilled me. Not the money, not the house, but the right to decide. I swallowed. I don't want to run, but I don't want to become someone who has to ask permission to withdraw his own money. Clara nodded. Then you reset the boundary. Now. I looked out the window, the harbor barely visible through the rain. I remembered storm days, standing in the wind, directing crews to hold lines so boats wouldn't slam into the dock. Back then, there was no time to be afraid. You just did what needed to be done. I turned back, my voice steadier. All right, help me prepare. I won't tell anyone at home everything. I'll move step by step. Clara picked up her pen, wrote a shorter, tighter list, then stopped and looked at me. "And James," she said, "there's one more thing." "I'm listening." Clara lowered her voice. "Ryan made a legal mistake. I saw his name listed as a recipient on a linked account that should only be used for household expenses, not external transfers. If the bank opens a file and you request a usage review, they'll ask why money was going into his personal account. And if any documents were created under the label of supporting an elderly person, he'll have a hard time explaining. I didn't answer right away. I just felt something shift quietly inside me. Not a sense of victory, more like finding a latch the intruder forgot to lock. I closed my notebook and slipped it into my jacket. "I'll do this properly," I said. Clara looked at me, her eyes firm but warm underneath. Doing it properly is enough. I stood up. When my hand touched the doorknob, I paused for a second. Outside were my house, Linda, Ryan, the words that had turned me into a problem. But in my pocket, the watch was still running. And in my head, a boundary line had just been redrawn, clearer, darker. I stepped out into the rain, got into my car, and knew I'd go home with a normal face. They would think I'd swallowed the insult. They would think I'd backed down. But in truth, I had just chosen something else. I had chosen to begin pushing back by holding on to my right to decide. I got home just as the rain stopped completely. The wet pavement reflected the porch light in long, yellow streaks. I didn't rush inside. I stood under the awning, listening to the sounds from within. The TV was on low. A spoon clinked against a glass. Everything looked normal enough that, from the outside, anyone would think I'd just gone out and come back for dinner like any other day. I opened the door. Linda was in the kitchen, her hair neatly tied back, her apron still damp. She turned to look at me, her eyes searching, but her mouth holding a thin smile. Ryan sat at the table, scrolling on his phone. He didn't stand. He didn't ask where I'd been. Just the stiff neck and the way he rested his elbow like someone claiming a seat. "You're back," Linda said, her voice light, though the tail end trembled slightly. "Did you call the bank?" "I handled what I needed to," I said. Ryan looked up, his eyes lighting the way they do when they smell a fight. "What did you do now?" I took off my jacket and hung it on the hook. I didn't look at Ryan yet. I went to the sink and washed my hands. Small actions help keep rhythm, keep me from getting pulled into theirs. When I finished, I turned and looked at both of them. "Starting today," I said, "any access to my personal accounts will require direct verification. Secondary cards are canceled. No one uses convenience as an excuse to move or withdraw my money anymore." Linda looked like she'd been slapped with a sheet of paper. She opened her mouth, closed it, then spoke quickly. "Are you punishing me? What did I do wrong? I'm just trying to take care of things. Do you know how much I handle in this house?" "Taking care of me doesn't mean holding the keys to my life," I said. The sentence came out softer than I expected. Ryan shot up from his chair. The chair legs screeched against the floor. "Who put this in your head, Clara? Or did you hire a lawyer already?" "I listened to this house," I said. "I listened to things I wasn't meant to hear, and I started seeing what I'd ignored." Linda stepped closer, her tone shifting to the soft register that used to make me lower my voice. "James, you're overreacting. You know you get worked up under pressure. Take a few days off. Don't turn this into something big." "No," I said. One word. It dropped the air in the kitchen like an empty barrel. Ryan sneered. "You think saying no fixes it? You're financially abusing my mother." Linda froze. I saw her flick a quick look at Ryan like he'd said something he shouldn't have in front of me. That glance said more than any defense. I looked at Ryan. "You use that word easily." Ryan blinked, then lifted his chin. "Words don't matter. You're locking money. You're controlling." I pulled out a chair and sat down. I didn't want to stand. Standing is the posture of arguing. I wanted to sit like the man who still had the right to ask questions in his own kitchen. "You say I'm controlling," I said. "Then explain the secondary account in your name." Linda jumped in immediately, her hands raised as if to block the conversation. "You're mistaken. The bank must be wrong. Those automated systems mess things up all the time." "The bank doesn't get the recipient's name wrong," I said, "and they don't get a signature wrong when it's in the file." Ryan stepped forward, his face reddening. "You're accusing me? You want to turn me into a thief in front of my mother?" "I'm asking," I said. "If you're innocent, answer." Ryan looked at Linda, searching. Linda looked down, then up again, her eyes suddenly wet. "James, don't do this. You're scaring me. I can't stand the way you're looking at me like I'm the enemy." In the past, that sentence would have softened me. I would have apologized. I would have said I was stressed. I would have hugged her and let it go. But that night, I saw something else. She was trying to pull me back into the familiar role, the man who blames himself so everyone else can stay comfortable. "Linda," I said slowly, If you were truly scared, you'd want everything on the table. You'd want to sit down and lay the paperwork out, not use tears to change the subject. Ryan clenched his fists. I saw the tendons in his neck rise. "You have no right," he said, his voice sharp. "You're getting old. You're not as sharp as you think. You'll ruin everything." "This house has never collapsed," I said. "I built it through storms, through lean years, through days I climbed the roof myself because I couldn't afford help. It didn't collapse because someone called me old." Ryan spun toward the display shelf by the kitchen door, where Linda kept her ceramic pieces. He swung his arm hard. A vase crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. The sound was sharp, like something being cut in half. Linda screamed, clutching her chest. "You see?" Linda turned to me, crying and pointing at Ryan as if the situation itself were to blame. "You're driving him crazy." Ryan was breathing hard. He kicked the chair again, tipping it. "If you keep this up, I'll sue. I'll protect my mother from you." The noise carried outside. I heard a door open next door, then someone calling, "Everything okay?" It was Frank again. I closed my eyes for a brief second, then stood and walked straight to the front door. Frank stood on his porch, his jacket half-zipped. Another neighbor peeked through a curtain. I turned back inside, looked at Ryan, then at Linda. "That's enough," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but there was no room left in it. Ryan started to speak, but I raised my hand. I said enough. I stepped onto the porch and looked directly at Frank. "We're fine, just family stuff. I can handle it." Frank nodded, still worried. He didn't ask more, but he lingered a moment longer, as if making sure I wasn't about to be shoved over. I went back inside and closed the door. As it shut, I saw Ryan smirk, like I'd just embarrassed him in front of the neighborhood. That was the moment I heard myself say it, clearly, without dodging, without apologizing for existing. "This house is mine." Linda looked like the air had left her lungs. Ryan froze, then exploded. "What did you say?" "I said this house is mine," I repeated. "And in my house, no one smashes things to intimidate. No one twists words like abuse to bend the truth. And no one blocks me from my own office." Some battles don't start with fists, but with standing your back straight. Ryan pointed at me, his hand shaking with anger. "You'll pay for this. You think you're winning? You freeze accounts and think you're safe? I'll make you explain yourself in court." Linda rushed forward, her voice pleading and furious at the same time. "James, please, don't push it this far. We're family. Do you want people laughing at us?" I looked at Linda. I let my silence answer for me. "Family doesn't turn someone into a file to be processed," I said. "If you stand with Ryan's plan, you're choosing a side?" Linda stepped back as if hurt. Ryan smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. He pulled out his phone and started typing, like someone sending a message he'd prepared in advance. I didn't rush over to grab it. I bent down, picked up a shard of broken ceramic, held it for a moment, then placed it on the counter like evidence. "Clean it up," I said to Ryan. "Now." Ryan didn't move. He stared at me like I was an obstacle. That night, I slept in the living room. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to lie next to someone who had just looked at me like an enemy. I heard Linda moving around in the bedroom, heard the closet door open, heard soft phone whispers. I didn't get up to listen in. I just stared at the ceiling I had once painted myself and kept my breathing steady. The next morning, as I was making coffee, the landline rang. A polite female voice introduced herself as calling from the county court office. She asked if I was James, then said a filing had just been submitted and that a process server would deliver documents that day. I set the coffee cup down very carefully, as if afraid the sound might spill. "What filing?" I asked. An application for emergency measures related to assets and representation rights," she said, her voice even, like reading from a form. "You will receive a copy." I looked out the window. The sun was out, as if there had been no breaking glass the night before, no threats. But inside the house, everything had changed color. I heard a car stop in the driveway. A stranger stepped onto the porch, a thick envelope in hand. I didn't need to open it to know. The lawsuit had really been filed. The server stood on the porch, the tired look of someone who does this work every day. He handed me the thick envelope and asked me to sign. I signed in my own hand, deliberately slow, my handwriting the same as always. When he turned away, I stood there for a few more seconds with the envelope in my hand, like I was holding something both hot and cold. In the kitchen, Linda was already awake. She stood close to the counter, both hands wrapped around a glass she wasn't drinking from. Ryan appeared right behind her, hair still messy, but his eyes were strangely alert. He looked at the envelope the way someone looks at an object finally placed where it belongs. "So you got it," Ryan said, his voice no longer shouting like the night before, but calmly frightening. "Now, just follow the proper procedure." I didn't answer. I carried the envelope into my office and closed the door. I heard footsteps in the hallway, heard Linda say something quietly, then silence. I sat at the desk and pulled the documents out. The words on the pages read like a stranger describing me: lacking capacity, easily agitated, unable to manage finances, a risk to family interests. There was even a request for the court to apply emergency measures to protect the assets and ensure care for me. The word protect sat on the page like a clean cloth laid over something dirty. I flipped to the page with the signature. A signature close enough to mine that, at a glance, most people would nod. But when I looked closely, it was too smooth, too even, missing the slight hesitation in the curve that my hand always makes when it's tired. And next to that signature was a list of things I had supposedly agreed to: authorizing account management, transferring house documents to a safe place, allowing Ryan to represent me with the bank and with law firms. I set the papers down, opened the drawer, and took out the notebook I'd been keeping over the past few days. The small, steady transfers, dates and times, transaction codes, recipient names. I didn't know how the court would see these numbers, but I knew at least they told the truth in their own way. I called Clara. She answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. I said just one sentence: "They filed." Clara didn't sigh or scold. "I'm coming," she said, "and don't stay alone in that house with them for too long. Bring every document you have. And remember, say less, show more proof." Around noon, Clara arrived in her old car, parking a short distance from my house, like someone who didn't want to put on a show for the neighbors. She stepped into my office, looked at the papers on the desk, and her face hardened. "That was fast," she said. "Ryan says it's procedure," I replied. Clara picked up the signature page, examined it, then shook her head. "This isn't clean." I swallowed. "Who will the court believe?" Clara looked straight at me. "The court believes what stands up. You stand up by staying calm and keeping the truth on paper." We spent another half-hour organizing. Clara clipped my documents in chronological order. She printed extra copies of bank statements she'd helped me request. Then she placed something on the desk that surprised me: the file transferring the dockside lot into the company 3 years earlier, with a clear notarization stamp, my real signature, and a note about separating business assets. "You don't bring this out early," Clara said. "Let them keep thinking they're touching the right spot." I nodded. I didn't like the feeling of holding cards back from my own family, but I liked the feeling of being cornered even less. The hearing date was set quickly, true to the word emergency. That morning, I wore something simple: a light-colored shirt, a dark jacket. I didn't want to look like someone going to battle. I just wanted to look like a man going to speak with an authority. In the courtroom, there was no shouting, no dramatic standing up, No movie-style arguments, just the sound of papers turning, shoes on the floor, and an atmosphere that made everyone lower their voice automatically. Ryan sat on the other side with a young lawyer, tailored suit, confident smile. Linda sat beside them, gripping her bag like she was afraid it might fall. She didn't look at me for long. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, like someone trying to believe she was doing the right thing. I sat on my side with Clara. She wasn't a lawyer, but she'd spent her life with ledgers and procedures, and sometimes that mattered more than polish. I kept the pocket watch in my jacket, the cold metal pressed against my chest. The judge entered. Everyone stood. His voice wasn't loud, but every sentence was clear. He summarized the request, then looked at Ryan. "You are the one who filed this?" Ryan stood, answering smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. We're concerned about Mr. James. Recently, he's been acting erratically, freezing accounts, causing distress. My mother, his wife, has been unable to purchase necessities. We fear he no longer has the capacity to manage finances and may jeopardize shared assets." Ryan's lawyer presented a stack of papers, spoke about authorization, interests, and mental health in a general way, carefully avoiding heavy terms but planting an unflattering image. The judge turned to me. "Mr. James, what do you have to say?" I stood. I didn't look at Ryan. I looked straight at the judge. "I froze access because there were signs money was being transferred out of an account I did not initiate," I said. "I didn't do it to punish anyone. I did it to stop the activity while I checked." Ryan's lawyer smiled faintly, as if I'd just admitted to being controlling. But I didn't stop. I handed Clara the prepared folder, and Clara passed it to the court. "These are my records," I said. "Dates, times, amounts, destinations. These are the statements, and this is the signature on the authorization the other side claims I signed." The judge took them and reviewed them for a long time. Then he looked at Ryan. "Mr. Ryan, when did Mr. James sign these documents?" Ryan didn't blink. "About 2 months ago, at home. He agreed because he said he wanted us to help." The judge nodded slowly, then asked a question so ordinary the room went silent because of its ordinariness. "When Mr. James signed, who witnessed it? Was it notarized? Was it recorded? Or is there any evidence beyond your word?" Ryan opened his mouth, then hesitated. His lawyer jumped in quickly. "Your Honor, within families, many documents are signed based on trust. Trust does not replace procedure." The judge cut in gently. He turned back to me. "Mr. James, did you sign this document?" I looked at the signature they claimed was mine. "No, Your Honor." Linda gasped sharply, like someone whose chest had just been squeezed and released. Ryan snapped his head toward his mother, then back at me, his eyes darkening. Clara asked to speak. Her voice was clear. She explained the differences between my notarized signature from 3 years ago and the one on the authorization. She spoke about the secondary account, the drip transfers, the recipient name. She didn't accuse, she presented data. The judge flipped through a bank statement and stopped at one line. He narrowed his eyes. "This transfer," he said, "went to an account in Ryan's name. Is that correct?" Ryan's lawyer bent down to look quickly, his face changing color. Ryan half stood as if to grab the paper, then caught himself. "How do you explain this?" the judge asked. Ryan swallowed. "That was reimbursement. I fronted money for home repairs. I help him a lot." I didn't counter immediately. I simply produced my old note about the time Ryan held the original dockside land contract, and Clara presented another document she'd saved for this moment. "Your Honor," Clara said, "we discovered a loan taken out in James's name, using his documents while Ryan had access to them. That loan bears a signature similar to the one on the authorization just presented, and unlike James's notarized signature. The air in the courtroom shifted. This was no longer a story about protecting an elderly man. It became a story about who was using whom. Ryan turned to his lawyer, panic in his eyes. Linda covered her face, her shoulders shaking. I heard her whisper something like a prayer, but no words formed. The judge looked at Ryan for a long time, then asked the question that froze the room. "Mr. Ryan, are you using Mr. James's documents to take out loans? Yes or no?" Ryan stood there, lips pale. He tried to smile, but the smile collapsed when the judge didn't move. I lightly touched the pocket watch in my jacket. In the courtroom, everything was measured in minutes and words, but that watch reminded me of mornings I used to wind it, believing this house was still a home. I looked up, not to seek pity, but to keep my back straight. Linda broke down crying, not wailing, just the fractured sound of someone realizing the ground beneath her had given way. Ryan went silent, silent like a locked door. The judge set the papers down. "The court will not issue emergency orders, stripping Mr. James of management rights based on documents showing signs of unreliability," he said. "On the contrary, the evidence presented suggests possible misuse of access and forgery. I am referring this matter for further investigation under appropriate procedure. In the meantime, the related accounts will be preserved per Mr. James's request." Linda looked up at me, eyes red. I didn't step toward her. I didn't need a victory built on stepping over someone else. I just stood there and listened to the gavel strike lightly to end the session. As people began to stand, Ryan remained seated, like he'd been nailed to the chair. His lawyer leaned down to say something, but Ryan didn't respond. Linda rose slowly, gripping the table edge as if afraid she'd fall. I gathered my files and quietly walked out of the courtroom. There was no shouting, no spectacle. But when the door closed behind me, I knew something had turned. Not because I'd defeated them, but because the truth had managed to stand up before I was forced to sit down for good. The courthouse steps smelled of damp stone and floor cleaner. I stepped into the sunlight, my eyes aching slightly, like I'd stared at something too long. Clara walked beside me, files tucked under her arm, her posture as straight as it had been in the courtroom. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just said one thing, very softly. "Don't go home alone." I nodded. In the parking lot, Clara opened her car door, then turned back to me, her eyes like someone used to seeing numbers collapse and knowing more layers would follow. "I'll call the bank, confirm the preservation order, and check the loan," she said. "Keep your phone on." I stood by my car, my hand resting on the roof like I needed something solid. Clara drove off first. I didn't start the engine right away. I watched people coming down the steps across the lot, laughing, chatting, as if life kept moving normally around a man who'd nearly been stamped incapacitated and then had it lifted in a single morning. I had just taken my keys out when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Linda. She wasn't moving fast, but she was clearly following. Her eyes were red, the light makeup around them smudged. She wasn't dressed as carefully as before. Just an old brown coat and a handbag clutched tight, like it held the last thing she owned. "James," she called. Her voice was hoarse. I turned. I didn't step forward or back. I stayed where I was. "What do you want?" She hesitated, glancing around the lot as if afraid someone might hear. "Can I talk to you alone for a minute?" I looked toward the courthouse. The glass doors reflected people passing by, all of them blurred like shadows. "Go ahead." Linda took a breath, her chest trembling. I didn't think it would turn out like this. What struck me most was that I didn't want to laugh or get angry. I just felt tired. A deep tiredness that had been building for a long time, waiting for a single touch to spill over. "How did you think it would turn out?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers had small calluses at the joints, the kind left by someone who once did real work, then spent years holding shopping bags and payment slips. "I was just afraid," she said. "Afraid that when you weren't strong anymore, I'd be left behind. Ryan would be left behind. I've relied on you for too long." "And you chose to turn me into a problem that needed fixing," I said. Not harsh, but clear. Linda flinched like I'd touched a sore spot. Ryan said if we didn't do it early, it would be harder later. He said you'd change your will, listen to outsiders, push us out." "I never threatened to push you out," I said. "I know," she blurted, like a confession. Then she fell silent. The silence stretched long enough that I heard a car at the far end of the lot backing up, tires crunching softly on gravel. I looked at Linda carefully. In that moment, she was no longer the woman who used to make the kitchen loud, who set the dinner table like a small stage. She looked like someone who'd been pulled too far from herself and had suddenly been forced to stop in front of a mirror. "You let things go too far," I said. Just one sentence. I didn't list details. I didn't accuse. I didn't need to. Linda looked at me. She didn't argue. She didn't say, "That's not true," or "You're also at fault." She just stood there, her shoulders sagging slightly, like someone who'd dropped something she'd been carrying for years. "Can I fix it?" she asked very softly. "If it were you, would you give the other person a chance to fix it?" I didn't answer right away. I looked toward the road, where sunlight flickered on car roofs. I thought about the kitchen, the sound of the vase breaking, the forged signature, the judge's question that had left Ryan speechless. Ryan's eyes, when everything came out, no longer arrogant, just hollow and angry. "Ryan will have to face the consequences," I said. "That's the law's job. I won't interfere to save him from what he did." Linda closed her eyes, tears spilling out. She wiped them quickly, like she didn't want me to see. "He's my son." "And he once called me Dad," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I just set the truth between us like a hot bowl. If you want to fix things, you start by stopping covering for him. Linda nodded slowly. I'll tell the truth to the lawyer. I won't stand behind those papers anymore." I looked at her. Part of me wanted to ask more, to dig into every month, every transfer, every time she looked at me and turned away. But I didn't. Revenge would have been easy right then, and it would have made me more like them than I could stand. I let out a breath. "Linda, you can be a bad person in one decision," I said, "but you don't have to become a bad person for the rest of your life." She looked at me like she didn't believe her ears, like she was waiting for me to lash out. But I didn't. I just stood there and let silence do the rest. A light breeze swept through the parking lot, rolling a few dried leaves along the painted lines. Linda pulled her coat tighter. Will you come home?" she asked. I looked at my car, looked at the keys in my hand, and I saw something clearly. If I went back right away, that house would pull me into the old role again. The peacekeeper, the one who cleans up broken pieces, the one who pretends everything can pass if he just stays quiet. "I'm not going back right now," I said. Linda panicked. "James, where are you going?" I opened the car door and sat down. I didn't start the engine right away. Through the glass, I saw Linda standing outside, growing smaller in the sunlight, like someone who had just lost her support and didn't know where to hold on. "You'll be okay," I said, "but you have to stand on your own, and you have to let Ryan face this himself." Linda placed her hand on the door frame, not touching me, just touching the cold metal. "I'm sorry," she said, not the kind of apology meant to end an argument. It landed like a stone. I nodded once. Then I closed the door. As the car rolled out of the lot, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the engine and the sound of tires on pavement set the rhythm. I drove slowly through familiar streets, past houses I had helped repair for neighbors, past the intersection with the cafe where Ryan and I once sat, drinking hot chocolate after fixing a roof. Memories pulled back like a taut string, soft and cutting at the same time. I didn't cry. I just felt a hollow open in my chest, big enough to hold a question I didn't yet have an answer to. I turned away from the road home. I let the car head toward the road that led to the waterfront, where the old harbor and warehouses sat silent like elderly people who no longer spoke but still remembered everything. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and that alone made me feel a little lighter. I drove out of the downtown area, past low buildings and weathered signs faded by wind. The closer I got to the water, the more the air changed. It smelled of salt, wet wood, and rusted metal, a scent anyone who had worked the docks would recognize instantly, like a hand pressed against the chest. My old house sat at the end of a narrow road, near an abandoned warehouse area. I had bought it when I was young, when I had nothing but an old pickup truck and my hands. Later, when life got better, I moved to a quieter neighborhood, one Linda preferred for its flower gardens and long drives. I kept this house the way you keep a work jacket you no longer wear but can't bring yourself to throw away. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds. The windshield reflected a man with graying hair, his collar slightly wrinkled from a long day. I placed my hand over the pocket watch in my coat pocket. It rested there, heavy and warm, like the only solid thing left that I could trust. The front door creaked softly when I pushed it open. Wind slipped through the gaps, carrying distant waves and the sound of ropes knocking against wooden posts at the dock. Inside it was dark and cold. I flipped the switch. The ceiling light flickered twice, then came on. Thin yellow light spread across the old wooden floor, where a long scratch ran like a memory line. I walked through the place the way you inspect a worksite. A small kitchen, old wooden cabinets, a steel sink dulled with age. The living room held only an armchair and a low table. Hooks still marked the wall where I used to hang rain-soaked jackets after dock shifts. Everything was so simple it was almost empty. But that emptiness didn't suffocate me. It let me breathe. There was a gap at the bottom corner of the living room window. Wind slipped in, tugging the thin curtain. I went to the car and brought in my old toolbox, the same red one with chipped paint I had once used to teach Ryan how to replace a door hinge. I set it down and opened it. The smell of old machine oil rose up, tightening my throat just a little. I removed the window trim and replaced the rotted rubber seal. My hands weren't as fast as they used to be, but I worked slowly and steadily. Each screw tightened felt like I was putting my own order back in place, with no one watching. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I checked the screen. Clara. "I've spoken with the bank," she said immediately. "The loan is under your company's name, but they used your personal authorization signature in the attached file. I requested copies. They'll send them to me and the attorney tomorrow. Don't sign anything, not even something that's just a confirmation." "I know," I said. I looked out the window where late afternoon light was fading over the water. "I'm at the old house." Clara paused for a beat. "Good, no, it's quieter there." I ended the call, put the phone away, and kept working. When the gap was sealed, the room suddenly felt calmer. Not empty calm, but the kind where the whistling wind, like whispering voices, was gone. I straightened up, my back creaking lightly. I went to the low table and took out the pocket watch. The case had a small scratch along the edge, one I'd once planned to polish but never did. I opened it and looked at the face. The second hand kept moving, steady and patient. I wound it. The soft clicking sound was so familiar it eased something inside me. I remembered my father doing the same thing every morning. He didn't talk much. He would sit under the kitchen light, wind his watch, sip his coffee, then go to work. He never let anyone call him just a name on paper. He never even had the chance to be called that, because he taught me something with his life. A man can lose many things, but he must not lose his stance. I closed the watch and slipped it back into my pocket, like putting away a reminder. On the living room wall hung an old wooden name board, the kind people mount on the porch. I had carved and painted it myself long ago, the letters now nearly worn away. When I moved, I took it down and left it here, like a forgotten piece of life. I looked at it for a moment, then wiped off the dust. The wood grain beneath was still beautiful. I carried the board outside and stood under the porch. The hook was still there, rusted. I replaced one screw, then hung the board back up. It wasn't perfect. The letters weren't sharp, the color uneven, but it stood there, and it was mine. I didn't call anyone to come see it. I didn't take a photo. I didn't need recognition. I just stood there, listening to the steady waves, like a long, deep exhale from the sea. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Linda. I saw her name on the screen and let it ring out. I didn't hate her. I just didn't want to open the door to any voice that would break this quiet. I went back inside, pulled the curtains, and turned on the small electric heater in the corner. A weak orange glow reflected on the wall. I went to the sink and washed my hands. The cold water stung my fingers slightly, but I liked it. It reminded me I was still here, still in my body, still able to do things. I took a blanket from the closet and spread it over the armchair. Sitting down, I heard the wood creak softly under my weight, the old house answering like an elderly person clearing his throat to say he was still alive. Outside, the sky darkened. Distant harbor lights came on, one by one. Those lights used to guide me home after night shifts. They still guided me now. The difference was, this time, I chose the way home. I thought about the court hearing that morning. About Ryan sitting there, trying to look calm until one question made everything collapse. About Linda standing beside him, eyes wavering, like someone pulled between two banks afraid to look down at the water. About Clara, who never pitied me, only gave me the truth and a way to stand. I didn't win in the way people like to tell stories. I didn't walk out like a king reclaiming his throne. I lost a marriage in the most painful way. I lost the sense of safety in the house I had built. I lost something called family that I thought would be as solid as oak. But in this old house, with the windows sealed against the wind and the name board rehung on the porch, I was no longer anyone's asset, no longer a temporary holder. I was just myself. I looked down at the watch in my pocket, feeling its weight, just right. I didn't win. I simply came back to life. Mornings near the harbor usually begin with birds and wind brushing against mooring lines. I woke up in the armchair, the blanket slipped to my knees. My back ached a little, but my head felt strangely clear. I stood, heated water, and made coffee with the simple filter I used to bring to job sites. The kettle whistled like a reminder that life keeps moving, even if last night I let a whole chapter slip from my hands. There were missed calls on my phone. Linda, Ryan, and a message from Clara, brief as always. The attorney has filed a counter-petition and requested an investigation into the signature issue. You don't need to appear again. Just sign what the attorney reviews and approves. I'll bring it to you. I read it and set the phone down. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel shaky. I felt like someone standing on a wooden pier after a storm, everything soaked and scattered, but the water no longer roaring. What followed moved faster than I expected. The lender requested a full review. A third party stepped in to examine signatures and authorizations. There were questions Ryan could no longer answer with his former confidence. There were transfers he couldn't explain, money passing through accounts no one was supposed to know about. When the law starts asking questions, bluster stops working. Ryan had to face the consequences of using the word protection to cover control. I didn't need to stand there pointing fingers. The truth stood up on its own. Linda called a few more times. I answered once on the afternoon of the third day while I was replacing a porch light. Her voice was small, like someone speaking in an empty room. "James, I've signed cooperation papers. I'll tell the truth." "Good," I said. "Are you coming home?" I looked at my shadow on the wooden floor. The sunlight slanted across it, making my hair look even grayer. "Not yet," I said. "Not to punish you, but because I need to know who I am when there's no one beside me defining it." Linda was quiet. I heard her breathing, then the sound of her trying to steady herself. I understand." I ended the call and set the phone back on the table. I didn't see myself as a winner. I saw myself as the last person willing to stand straight in my own story. There's something strange about silence. Only when everything quiets down do you realize how loud the years before were. Not loud with voices, but loud with compromise. I had grown used to giving in to keep the peace, used to letting things slide to make tomorrow easier, used to smiling things away. I once thought silence was kindness, but silence can also be how you hand over the keys to your life, then convince yourself you did it for family. The price I paid wasn't money. Money is just numbers on paper, no matter who once told me I was only a name on it. The price was a house without familiar voices, a table with no one sitting across from me, phone numbers still saved but no longer part of my life, loneliness. Yes. But honest loneliness, not the kind where you sit in a crowded house and are still treated like decoration. I don't hate Linda in the sense of wanting to ruin her life. I said one thing to her, and I meant it. She let things go too far, and she will have to live with that truth. As for me, I don't need another act of revenge to feel my worth. I already have what I needed most: boundaries. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Don't hand over your right to live for the sake of convenience. Don't sign what you don't fully understand just to keep the house peaceful. Don't let fear of conflict give others permission to decide what you're allowed to do with your own life. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to say one clear sentence and accept the awkward air that follows, instead of living a lifetime inside a blurred agreement. I'm telling this story not so anyone will copy what I did, and not to prove that I was right and they were wrong. This is a fictional story, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, supported by AI and edited by humans to invite reflection and values. It does not encourage you to repeat the actions in the story, especially in circumstances that could harm you or others. Everyone has a different life, different ties, and different solutions that fit them. But if you ask me what the real value was that I carried out of that wreckage, it was the ability to recognize my own boundaries. Trust isn't bad, but blind trust is dangerous. Awareness doesn't mean becoming cold. Awareness means knowing what's happening, knowing who stands in front of you, and knowing where you need to stand so you don't lose yourself. If I have one gift to offer you, it's the right to stand upright in your own life, the right to question, the right to pause before a signature, the right to say no without apologizing for wanting to live honestly. That night when everything had settled, I stood on the porch of the old house. A light breeze moved through. The wooden name board hung on its new hook, not as pretty as a store-bought sign, but it was mine. I reached into my pocket and took out the pocket watch. Yellow light reflected off the glass. The hour hand moved slowly, as it always does, no matter who betrays whom, no matter who wins or loses. I closed the watch. The soft click sounded, just loud enough for me to hear, and I thought that maybe it was the sound of a chapter closing, not loudly, not for anyone else to witness, but real. If you stayed until here, thank you. Truly. You gave me something valuable, your time and your attention. If this story touched you at any point, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. and at what moment of the day. In your car, in your living room, or on a quiet evening when it's just you. One line is enough. It doesn't just help the channel reach others, it helps people know they're not the only ones who've ever felt pushed to the edge of their own family. If this story meant something to you, tap like as a way of nodding to yourself. And if you want to hear more stories that hold tension while still respecting you, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'd be glad to have you with me in the next videos.